This is chapter 2 from your textbook, which focuses on constructing a research question. It also introduces terminology related to both variables as well as hypotheses. So, a return to what we introduced in the first chapter, which was our 8-step research model, the process by which sociologists ask questions, gather data, analyze data, then share their results. So particularly this chapter focused on kind of steps 1 and 2, selecting a topic and defining a problem. But it also, as I just indicated, also gave you the terminology around how to formulate a hypothesis. So also step 4. Chapter 3, which was about writing a literature review, I provided separate slides as well as a separate video for that. So beginning with choosing a research topic, and you all will be in this position yourselves in this class. So, really consider the book suggestions. What are you passionate about? What do you like to read about? What catches your eye? What are you always talking to your friends about or going down internet rabbit holes trying to study? What are you seeking new information about? If this was a real research project, one that you would be doing for like your master's thesis or, your doctoral dissertation, you would be investing so much time, energy, effort, blood, sweat, and tears into this topic. So you don't want to choose something that, you're going to burn out on or tire of or bore. You really want to choose something that you're going to be passionate about learning about as much as you can, and then contributing to that body of knowledge. And I really think like the great thing about sociology is it is such an all-encompassing discipline. Like you can pretty much study almost anything related to human society from the sociological perspective. But particularly what would help you narrow down your focus and your topic is to consider what you would ultimately want to contribute to the discipline and to larger society. So, when we talk about what do sociologists do with their findings, there are kind of 3 kind of broad categories that characterize what sociologists do with their findings. The first one is called basic sociology. This is when you analyze an aspect of society primarily to generate new knowledge and ideas, and you publish your findings in books and sociology journals. And not always, but a lot of times, maybe this new knowledge and ideas is really only pertinent or of interest to other sociologists within your subfield. Your book calls this type of sociology fundamental research. Now, the other kind of possibility in terms of like what you would want to do with your findings is if you want to use your findings to solve society's problems. Your book calls this applied research, call this applied sociology, where you're using sociology to solve society's problems. So usually those types of topics and questions are related to social problems and social conditions that we see in a society. Things like, poverty or educational inequity or sexism. Public sociology is somewhere in the middle between pure research and reform. And so public sociologists are trying to, maybe they're not studying or maybe they're not contributing directly to social change, but they are kind of constructing knowledge around topics that are perhaps pertinent to social conditions and social change. So, once you have, kind of a broad sense of what you're interested in and passionate about, you then need to narrow your research topic. And your book discusses that you narrow your topic both by narrowing the constructs of your interests and then your population of interest. So you start off with a broad topic and then you narrow it so it's more specific. And one way you can think about narrowing it to something more specific is being really clear. Do people understand what I'm saying and meaning when I word this topic in this way. So, you know, if you start off with something really broad, like your book did about education, you perhaps keep narrowing it until it becomes like public education in elementary schools in the US. And the other way you narrow it is by your population of interest. So, you know, once you kind of make your concepts clearer and more concrete, you then narrow who your population of interest is, what group, what region, what demographic characteristics you want to focus on. So for the book's example, it was fathers of, fathers of children who are in public education, public schools, public elementary schools in the US. So, you know, this process of asking follow-up questions in order to narrow down your topic, your book goes over that in Research Workshop 2.1, and that's on pages 31 and 32. And certainly the first part of your proposal activity really kind of deals with that whole narrowing the topic down. So pay close attention to the types of questions that the authors pose to themselves in that workshop in order to get that narrow topic, because that is what you would need to do in order to move your broad topic to a much more narrow focus. Now, that step of making your topic itself more narrow and more concrete and more understandable, that brings us to our next step, which involves conceptualization and operationalization. And so your book notes that, you know, usually in order to do this step, it requires research, right? And it suggests you go from non-scientific academic sources to more scientific academic sources. So, you know, what you would be reading and trying to get a look for is like, how do people conceptualize this topic I'm interested in? And then specifically, like, how do they measure it? How do they operationalize it? And so conceptualization refers to the process of breaking down our constructs into smaller pieces and clarifying those pieces so we know exactly the meaning of each piece of each construct. And by construct, I mean the general or abstract terms that are not straightforward, right? And that could be possibly understood differently by different people. So these are the parts of your topic that perhaps require clarification so that everyone's on the same page. And once you kind of clarify them and you have come to kind of this concrete kind of conceptualization of this is what I'm going to be looking for in my research project, then you move to the next step of operationalization. And this is the process of turning your constructs into actual variables that can be measured. And variables are specific features or aspects of your construct that can take on different values within your study population. That's why it's called variable. It can vary, right? So this is what you're going to be measuring in your population. So before we move much further, let's just kind of do it together, do an example together. So let's say my topic is children's ethical beliefs in relationship to their interest in superheroes. So like I'm interested in like, how do children form, you know, like what type of ethical beliefs, what type of ethical sense do they make of the world, and how might that be related to their interest in superheroes? So if that's my topic, what constructs need to be further conceptualized, right? So if you're looking at that, it's like, what could people possibly misunderstand? What could people possibly define differently? And so this is what I pulled out. The constructs that need to be further conceptualized are children, ethical beliefs, interest, and superheroes. And so this is where I begin that process of asking myself, what do I mean by blank in my study? So what do I mean by children in my study? You know, am I talking about everyone under the age of 18? You know, or I'm talking specifically about school-age children? Am I talking specifically about elementary school-age children, right? I have to conceptualize, I have to define what it is that I mean by that given construct. Now you do that for each construct. You come up with an operational definition. How are you going to measure it in your study? Then once you've done that, then it then gets operationalized into variables. So then you're asking the question of, how will I measure blank in my study? So the example that I'm giving here is ethical beliefs. in my study, it is conceptualized as the belief in there being right and wrong in society, that there should be equality, and that good is more likely to overcome or triumph over bad. That's how I'm conceptualizing ethical beliefs. And of course, in a perfect world, I would have done some research and study, and I would have been like, hey, how do other people conceptualize ethical beliefs? Because keep in mind, you're trying to build upon the body of knowledge that already exists. But for my fake example, I literally made this up off the top of my head. So if that's how I conceptualize ethical beliefs, then I might measure it by variables asking how likely someone agrees with the following statements. I believe that actions and behaviors are either good or bad with very little in between. I believe that everyone in society is equal and should be treated the same. I believe that in most scenarios, good people will triumph over bad people. And I'm going to measure this like a Likert scale, where I give 4 options. I very much agree, I disagree, I very much disagree. Now, of course, I could have added like a neutral position, but your book makes a really good point that sometimes, when you give people a neutral position, like I neither agree nor disagree, then that'll be the one that they'll default to. And it might just lead to you having not very meaningful results. So, that's something that, once again, you need to consider, as well as look at how has this been handled in past research. So, this is what's meant by that conceptualization and operationalization processes. They work hand in hand. So now let's kind of pick apart variables. So I say, you take your constructs and you operationalize them, you turn them into variables, which are, those units of measurement within your study, right? These are characteristics that vary within your study, and this is how you're going to measure it. So the next part of your chapter really focuses on all the different types of variables that can exist within your study population in your your research model. And so a variable is this piece of information, and the goal is we want to collect it from most of everyone who is participating in the study, because we don't want to have missing data. And that's when there is a variable that we don't have information for some study participant, some person from our population. So we want to have as complete data as possible. So we want to gather, consistently, this information from everyone that's in your study population. So the primary variables of interest in most research studies, particularly if we're doing deductive research, is the independent variable and the dependent variable. And the independent variable, this is the variable that influences the change in the dependent variable. In sociology, oftentimes we want to avoid terms kind of indicating causality, unless we're really clear that there is a causal relationship. And just because a lot of things related to human behavior and conditions are hard to meet kind of the standards of causality, usually we're talking about correlation, right? That we're saying that something goes together, that something influences, that there seems to be this relationship, but we don't want to say that something causes something else. So that's why it's worded this way. The independent variable is what is influencing the change in the dependent variable. And so sometimes the IV is very clear, and sometimes it's not. So oftentimes, if you're talking about like sex, if you're talking about like race, if you're talking about age, like oftentimes those are very, very clear independent variables, because it doesn't make sense for it to be the opposite. So let's take sex and career goals. So if, my question is, does a person's sex influence what their career goals are during their elementary school years, right? Just to narrow it down further. What am I indicating is the independent variable in that question? What am I indicating is going to be the dependent variable? It's very clear that it's sex, right? We're saying a person's sex influences their career goals during elementary school. because it wouldn't make opposite sense, right? You couldn't say, oh, it's a person's career goals that's actually determining their sex in elementary school, right? You know, if you wanted to be a firefighter, that didn't automatically like make you a boy, right? That's so, like I said, sometimes it's very clear. Sometimes it's not as clear. So consider that first one, amount of time on social media and GPA. This is one of those ones where it kind of depends on what you're arguing. If what you're arguing is the amount of time that someone spends on social media influences their GPA, then social media, or the amount of time on social media, is the independent variable, GPA is the dependent variable. But if what you're saying is a person's GPA influences how much time they spend on social media, because maybe if they have a high GPA, they are prioritizing other things versus being on social media. Now all of a sudden GPA becomes the independent variable and social media becomes the dependent variable, and GPA is the independent variable. So, you know, you want to look at how you're wording your hypothesis. If you're reading other people's research, you know, and most of the time they'll clearly indicate what their hypothesis is, but they don't necessarily always pinpoint or, you know, point out for you what their independent dependent variable is. Just take a moment and make sure that you understand what people are arguing. You know, what is the IV, what is the DV, because that is kind of the building block for their research model. Because then all the rest of the variables that your book talks about become a lot more confusing. So let's talk about some of those variables now. Control variables. These are variables that are not directly related to the study, but they're important for understanding the relationship between the variables of our focus. And we call them control variables because normally what we say is something like, oh, I controlled for race and social class, right? So, you know, going back to my sex and career goals, right? Maybe we also know from our reading that race can influence what children want to grow up to be, as well as their social class. And you want to make sure that you control for that because, you know, you want to just isolate the relationship between sex and career goals. So control variables are the variables that we control for in our study. And so that little image there, you know, if you're wanting to, if your independent variable is weather, you know, and the dependent variable is how good the fishing is that day, then things that you might want to control for is, you know, you want to make sure that, you know, people are, you're controlling for the type of bait that the people are using. You're controlling for like the quality of rod or their experience as fishers, because those are types of things that could influence that relationship between your IV and your DV. And you want to make sure that you really are truly capturing the relationship between IV and DV. Once again, you know the variables to control for by doing your research. You see what other people who have studied your topic have controlled for, and you make sure you control for those same things at a minimum. Now, like, what about, you know, these other variables that can exist? Your book talks about kind of two in particular. They take a closer look at what they call intervening or confounding variables, and then extraneous disturbance variables. So intervening confounding variables, they influence the independent variable in such a way that the results from the dependent variable become untrustworthy. So basically, this type of variable has a relationship, it influences both the IV and the DV in such a way that maybe the relationship that you think you're seeing between the IV and DV doesn't even exist. So one of the best examples is that, like, you know, you think that how much ice cream people eat influences the number of sunburns that they have, because you've noticed that during the months when people eat a lot of ice cream, the hospital and doctor's offices see a lot of patients with sunburn diagnoses. And you're like, oh, maybe there's some type of weird relationship between the ice cream they're eating and their, developing a sunburn. But in reality, there is a confounding variable, and the confounding variable is hot temperatures, because when it's hot outside, this encourages people to eat a lot of ice cream to cool down. And it also means when it's hot outside and the sun is burning bright, that a lot of people get sunburns. And so the idea is that if you controlled for, right, the hot temperatures, that relationship between ice cream consumption and sunburns would probably completely go away. And so this is the danger of not knowing and controlling for these potential confounding variables. Now, what about extraneous or disturbance variables? So these are variables, and the word that your textbook uses is lurking. They're lurking in our study population, and sometimes we have not collected data on that variable, and it can disturb the findings of our dependent variable. Usually, these variables are usually not related at all to the independent variable. That's why they're different than confounding variables. So let's look at this example that I gave here. You are looking at, people's drinking habits as being a cause or correlate to heart disease, right? So drinking habits is the IV, heart disease is the DV. However, another thing unrelated to drinking habits might just be their diet and their lifestyle, like, how often they work out. That also influences a person's propensity to heart disease as well, having nothing to do with drinking. So once again, the relationship between drinking and heart disease can be disturbed by these extraneous values. So another type of value that you want to control for, and to maybe control for it by your research. So a closer look at these confounding intervening variables. I don't know why I thought you needed a closer look. I guess I just wanted to make sure that you understand that, confounding variables have a relationship with both independent variables and dependent variables. So sometimes to the degree that the relationship that you thought you saw between the IV and the DV are what we call a spurious correlation. That's probably why I put that image there. I wanted you to know the word spurious. So when the confounding variable is actually the hidden explanation behind the relationship, then the relationship that you thought you were witnessing is called spurious. So here's another example, once again related to higher temperatures, ice cream sales, but instead of sunburns, we now have shark attacks. So it's not that ice cream sales can predict or be a cause of shark attacks, but it's the fact that, once again, higher temperatures are the intervening variable. Ice cream sales go up in higher temperatures. More people go to the beach and get in the water during the summer during higher temperatures. And so that's what's influencing the shark attacks. There really isn't a relationship between ice cream sales and shark attacks. That's a spurious correlation. All right. Let's tackle one last set of variables, variable terminology, and that's moderator and mediators. Moderator variables are variables that can strengthen or weaken an established relationship between the independent and dependent variable. So in this case, it isn't so much that the relationship is spurious, but the extent to which the relationship exists is moderated by another variable. Once again, you will be aware of possible moderator variables by doing reading and research about your topic. So the example of moderator variables that you see here is, if the question is, hours of study, does the amount of study hours influence your exam score, right? So, and let's say your hypothesis is yes, the amount of time that a person spends studying impacts how high of a score they get on the exam. So your hours of study is the IV and your exam score is the DV. Well, a possible moderator variable might be IQ. Maybe depending, a really smart person does not need to study as much, and a person who maybe doesn't have as high of an IQ needs to study more, but even doing so, maybe their exam score is still not going to be as high as the person with high IQ who studied less. And so you see how that relationship between hours of study and exam score becomes a lot less straightforward when you consider IQ. Mediators are intervening variables that interfere with the relationship between the main IV and DV. And mediator variables are such that they may make it so that the relationship between IV and DV, it might not even exist anymore. And so the example here is number of practice problems completed. So the hours of study we thought influenced exam score, but maybe it is the hours of study, influence the number of practice problems you completed. And that's really what has the relationship with the exam score. So maybe it's not whether or not you spent 4 hours studying, but maybe it's the fact that, you did 50 practice problems, and that many practice problems just led to you being more prepared for the exam versus someone who maybe spent 4 hours studying but only did 5 practice problems, in which case, they didn't do as well on the exam because really it was about the practice problems completed and not necessarily the amount of time they spent studying. Admittedly, moderator, mediator, these types of intervening variables are confusing. So I have a couple of extra slides to try to help shed some light on that distinction. One way that you can distinguish between is it a mediator or is it a moderator is to kind of look at like the order of causality. So a mediator must be a causal result of the IV and a causal antecedent of the DV, meaning it has to come after the IV and it has to be a result of the IV and it has to happen before the DV. So let's go back to my example, hours of study. Well, yes, you spending time studying has to come before practice problems completed, right? Those two things, you have to be studying in order to do the practice problems. And the practice problems precedes you then taking the exam. So that is a mediator. And you see, that doesn't really work with IQ. That's why we know that IQ can't be a mediator. Hours of study IQ doesn't result from the hours of study, right? We IQ tests are given at all stages of our life, and usually the idea is you can't study for them. So that is one way you can distinguish between mediators and moderators. And so if you use that rigid criteria, consider the relationship between exercise and weight loss. Exercise is the IV, you think that explains weight loss. Well, they want you to consider these possible intervening variables: caloric intake, well-being, gender, age, prior weight. Keep in mind that you are looking for something, if you're talking about a mediator, you're looking for something that is the result of exercise and happens before your weight loss. Well, your age is not the result of exercise. Your gender is not the result of exercise. So prior weight, that might be the result of exercise and it precedes your weight loss. Well-being, just a general sense of wellness, that might be a result of your history of exercise, and that precedes your subsequent weight loss. Caloric intake, that one could maybe, you can make an argument that might be related to your exercise, and it certainly precedes weight loss. So those are the mediators, and then the moderators are the ones that aren't a causal result of the IV. So we definitely know in this case, gender and age can't be mediators in this research model. Another variable another slide related to moderator mediator variables. In this one is giving you another set of examples. So moderator, third variable that affects the strength of the relationship between the two other variables, right? And so the example here is relationship between performance and salary depends on gender. And so in this case, the idea being that your gender maybe impacts how people view your performance, and therefore impacts also what salary that they offer you, that it might moderate that relationship, that being a high performance and being a male might lead to much higher salary than having a high performance but being female. Mediator, third variable that acts as a generative mechanism between two other variables. And so once again, it's that it causes X1 causes X2, which causes Y. And so it's that X2, it's that mediator variable. Once again, the idea is a result of the independent variable, and it is causal antecedent to the dependent variable. So before we get into hypotheses, which is kind of the final set of terms that this chapter introduced, I want to remind you that in sociology, we don't always have that step, that we have that step in the deductive research process. We form a hypothesis because we find out what is already known. So, we're able to make some type of plausible, logical, statement of what we expect to find when we collect our data. But sociologists also do inductive research, and in inductive research, there is no hypothesis. Instead, there's just, as your book notes, like it, asking this open-ended question, then going out and collecting the data. But if you are doing deductive research and you are formulating a hypothesis, what do we call it? How do we write it? So as your book explains, technically speaking, the hypothesis is called the alternative hypothesis. It is our possible prediction of the relationship between our primary variables. We make this prediction based on literature and theory before we actually test it. So we truly don't know if it's what we're going to find or not. The null hypothesis claims that there is no relationship between the variables of interest in our study. And this is actually the hypothesis that we're testing. We're testing whether or not there is no relationship between our IV and our DV. If we find that there is a relationship, we reject the null hypothesis and we accept one of our alternative hypotheses, because oftentimes you have multiple alternative hypotheses. We falsify the null. We've proven it false, that there is no relationship between our variables. If we don't find a relationship between our variables, there is no relationship, what we say is we fail to reject the null. We don't accept the null, we just fail to reject the null. Because keep in mind, we're always just keeping it, the possibility open that, of falsification, right? The whole idea is that we build new knowledge by falsifying previously accepted knowledge. And so that's reflected in this language around the null hypothesis versus the alternative hypothesis. Now, your alternative hypothesis can be directional or it can be non-directional. Directional hypothesis is when you predict a specific course for your variables, right? You say something is more, you say it's greater, or it positively influences, or it negatively influences. Basically, you're giving a direction to your relationship. And we call this a one-tailed hypothesis. A non-directional hypothesis, you don't give a direction. You just basically say, I think there's a relationship between these variables. And admittedly, if you don't bother to give a direction, sometimes this type of hypothesis is just more apt to be expressed in the form of a research question, right? Does a relationship exist between X and Y? And so the little image there I give to help you remember one-tailed, two-tailed, happy dog will eat more, right? You're saying you're giving it a direction. They're gonna eat more. And so that's a one-tailed hypothesis, yes or no. If you are just saying that there's a relationship, you might say the mood affects the appetite of dogs, or maybe you would voice it in a question. How does mood affect the appetites of dogs? And now, of course, it could be more or less. And so we call that a two-tailed hypothesis. So that is hypotheses. The final kind of point that I want to make is related to types of questions, because, you know, even if you are going to have a directional hypothesis, I still suggest that you consider still taking the time to develop your question into a question, right? To not just kind of skip to the hypothesis step, right? To still think about your question in question form before you provide an answer to your question in hypothesis form. And that's just because I want you to make sure that you are asking the right type of question. Because when it comes to systematic research, the type of question that systematic research can answer is empirical questions, questions that you can answer by collecting data. Can't answer aesthetic questions, you know, what's better, who's better looking, what tastes better. Can't answer moral questions. Is this right? Is this moral? And can't answer interpretation questions. What do you think that this artist means? What do you think this piece of art symbolizes? Now, the great thing is, I think, is that any of those questions, aesthetic, moral, or interpretive, can be turned into empirical questions. You just have to change your wording. So something like an aesthetic question, what is tastier, Thai food or Mexican food? You know, that isn't an empirical question because it is a matter of taste. You can turn that into an empirical question. You can say, does the region of the country you grow up in influence whether you believe Thai or Mexican food is tastier? Or you can say, for moral question, right, you can't ask a question like, is capital punishment moral? Because once again, kind of like taste, morals are personal and unique to the individual. What you can do is turn it into an empirical question and say, does a person's religious affiliation influence their likelihood to believe that capital punishment is or is not moral, right? So hopefully you can kind of see the distinction there. Final, just kind of point of point I want to just emphasize before I leave this chapter is I am not a visualization person. When I write out my ideas, I take a lot of notes, I make outlines, I highlight, and that's how I you know, that's how I kind of collect knowledge, and that's how I formulate my own. I just kind of, you know, write out my ideas in draft versions. But if you are a visualization person, right, and you do like, you know, the thought bubbles and the lines, linking different ideas together, you know, strongly consider sketching your ideas out like figure 2.2. It's not something I require because I'm a big believer in I don't ask you all to do things that I don't do, and I don't do visualization, but I do believe in making sure that you have all the tools to be successful. So if you are a visual learner and visualization does help you, by all means, consider doing something like figure 2.2 when you're trying to think out your topic and developing it into a question, developing it into a hypothesis. And so that is it for this chapter.